The blow landed before anyone could pretend not to see it. Under the chandeliers of a Manhattan ballroom, Gavin Cartwright struck his pregnant wife in front of colleagues, investors, and the woman standing at his side. His voice followed sharp, dismissive, reducing Joanna Cartwright to something disposable. No one intervened. A few watched. One person recorded. Joanna didn't cry. She didn't speak. She only looked at the room, calm, steady, as if memorizing every face. No one there understood what she already knew. And what would come next? If you believe actions should have consequences even when power tries to hide them, stay with this story. Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I read every comment, and if stories about quiet strength and real justice matter to you, consider subscribing. Joanna Cartwright had always understood the value of silence. Not the kind that came from fear, nor the kind imposed by others, but the deliberate, measured quiet that allowed truth to reveal itself over time. It was a discipline she had learned long before she ever met Gavin, shaped in rooms where voices rarely rose but decisions carried weight that could alter entire industries. She was born into the Cartwright family, a name that rarely appeared in headlines but lingered in the fine print of acquisitions, mergers, and silent capital movements. The Cartwright Trust had no need for public recognition. Influence in her world had always moved discreetly through signatures, not speeches. From a young age, Joanna had been taught how to read financial statements before she could legally sign one. She learned to track inconsistencies in numbers, to recognize patterns in behavior, and most importantly, to observe without interruption. Her father used to say that the loudest person in the room was often the least informed. Joanna had listened. And she had remembered. When she met Gavin Cartwright, then just Gavin Hale, a man with ambition larger than his resources, he was everything her world was not. He spoke quickly, confidently, with a kind of urgency that made people believe in momentum even when there was none. He didn't come from legacy. He came from hunger. That had been part of his appeal. They met at a networking event. Neither of them were meant to attend. Gavin had slipped in through an extended invitation. Joanna had been there officially, though she had no interest in being noticed. He had approached her with a pitch before he knew her name, something about a tech logistics platform that would redefine supply chains. She had asked him 3 questions. He hadn't answered them well, but he hadn't backed down either. That was what she remembered most. Not brilliance, not precision, persistence. They saw each other again, then again after that. Gavin began refining his pitch. Joanna began asking better questions. Somewhere between his ambition and her restraint, something resembling balance had formed. Their relationship, like most things Joanna allowed into her life, developed quietly. When Gavin proposed, it wasn't extravagant. It was sincere, direct, slightly imperfect. He promised he would build something real, not just for himself, but for them. Joanna had believed him. At the time, belief had not felt like a risk. The early years of their marriage were not easy, but they were honest. Gavin worked relentlessly, often sleeping in the office. Joanna stayed beside him, though not always visibly. She reviewed documents, flagged inconsistencies, suggested revisions that he sometimes accepted and sometimes ignored. When his company began to falter, cash flow tightening, investors pulling back, he didn't immediately tell her how bad it had become. But Joanna already knew. She had seen the numbers. She had seen the silence between his words. And without announcement, without negotiation, she made a decision that would alter both of their lives. The Cartwright Trust extended an investment into Gavin's company through a series of layered entities, quiet, legally precise, and entirely invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look. It was structured to stabilize the company, to give it time, and most importantly, to protect control. Gavin never questioned it deeply. He called it luck, a miracle, a turning point. Joanna never corrected him. At the time, she told herself it wasn't deception. It was support. She didn't want to overshadow his achievement. She wanted him to believe he had built something on his own. For a while, that belief seemed to make him stronger. The company recovered. Then it grew. Then it expanded beyond its original scope. New offices, new hires, media attention. Gavin adapted quickly to success. Perhaps too quickly. Confidence turned into certainty. Certainty over time became entitlement. Joanna noticed the shift before anyone else did, but she said nothing. Not because she didn't see it, but because she was waiting to understand it fully. It began with small things. Gavin stopped asking for her input. At first, it was framed as efficiency. "You don't need to worry about this," he would say. I've got it handled. Then came the schedule changes. Late nights became expected, business trips extended without explanation, calls taken in other rooms, doors closing just slightly too quickly. None of these things on their own were proof of anything, but Joanna had never relied on single moments. She relied on patterns. She began writing things down, not obsessively, not emotionally, just factually. Dates, times, observations. Tuesday, dinner canceled. Claimed investor meeting. No calendar entry. Thursday, phone locked immediately after message. Unusual. Saturday, left at 6:40 a.m. Said Jim. Gym closed until 8. There was no accusation in her notes. No conclusions. Only records. By the time she discovered she was pregnant, Joanna had already begun to understand that something in her marriage had shifted beyond repair. But the pregnancy changed the equation. Not emotionally, Joanna had long since learned to separate emotion from decision, but strategically. A child meant permanence. It meant consequences that extended beyond herself. For a brief moment, she considered the possibility that this could bring Gavin back into alignment. That responsibility might recalibrate whatever had drifted within him. When she told him, his reaction was appropriate, surprised, pleased, proud even, but it was brief, too brief. The next morning he returned to work as if nothing had changed. Joanna didn't comment on it. Instead, she added a new section to her notes. Pregnancy disclosed. Reaction minimal. Observe behavioral change over next 14 days. There was no measurable change. If anything, Gavin became more distant. His phone was never out of reach. His attention fragmented. Conversations shortened. Joanna began noticing something else, not just absence, but redirection. There were new names appearing in his calendar. One in particular appeared more frequently than the others. L. Monroe. At first, it was listed among team meetings, then private sessions, then dinners that were labeled as client relations. Joanna didn't ask who Lila Monroe was. She preferred to find out on her own. It took less than an hour. Lila Monroe had joined the company 3 months earlier, mid-level marketing strategist. Strong academic background, impressive early career, no prior connection to Gavin, at least none that was documented. Joanna studied her profile without judgment. Then she added a new line to her notes. Lila Monroe. Frequency increasing. Monitor. From that point on, Joanna paid closer attention. Not to Gavin's words, but to what he avoided saying. Every silence, every deflection, every minor inconsistency, she documented them with the same calm precision she had been taught as a child. She did not confront him. Not yet. Because Joanna Cartwright understood something that Gavin had long forgotten. Truth did not need to be forced. It only needed to be given enough time to surface. And when it did, it would not arrive as an argument. It would arrive as evidence. By the time the gala invitation arrived, formal embossed, addressed to both of them, Joanna had already gathered more than enough to confirm what she suspected. But confirmation was not her objective. Not yet. She wasn't interested in catching Gavin. She was interested in understanding exactly how far he had gone, and how much he believed he controlled. Because what Gavin still did not realize, what no one in that company realized, was that Joanna had never lost control at all. She had simply chosen not to use it. Until now. Lila Monroe did not enter the company loudly. She arrived the way certain changes always did, quietly, efficiently, and with just enough competence to avoid suspicion. Her resume was strong without being extraordinary, her interviews precise without being memorable. To most, she was simply another capable hire in a growing department. But Gavin noticed her immediately. Not because she was the most qualified, because she paid attention to him in a way others no longer did. It began during a quarterly strategy meeting. Lila spoke only once, offering a concise observation about customer retention data that had been overlooked. It wasn't groundbreaking, but it was delivered with clarity and, more importantly, with timing. Gavin responded. After the meeting, he asked her to stay behind. Joanna would later note the timestamp of that meeting, not because of what was said, but because of what followed. From that day forward, Lila Monroe's presence in Gavin's schedule increased with quiet consistency. At first, it was professional. Follow-up on marketing metrics, campaign review, strategy alignment. The titles were appropriate. The durations were not. 30-minute meetings extended to an hour. 1 hour extended to 2. Some appeared on the official calendar. Others did not. Joanna noticed both. She never needed direct access to Gavin's phone. She had long ago learned that people revealed more through what they omitted than what they displayed. His calendar sync patterns his sudden unavailability during predictable hours, the way he began stepping outside to take calls. All of it formed a structure that was easy to map. She mapped it. Recurring private meetings. Tuesday, Thursday evenings. Unscheduled gap. 7:15 p.m. to 9:00 p.m. 3 consecutive weeks. Phone behavior. Increasing secrecy. There was no anger in her handwriting. Only structure. The first tangible confirmation came on a Thursday evening. Gavin had said he would be late. A client dinner, he explained, offering the kind of vague detail that discouraged follow-up questions. Joanna had nodded as she always did. But she didn't stay home. Instead, she drove to the restaurant he mentioned, not to confront him, not to interrupt, but to observe. She didn't enter immediately. From across the street, through the reflection of the glass, she saw them. Gavin and Lila sat at a corner table angled slightly away from the main dining room. Too close for a professional meeting, too relaxed for a negotiation. There were no documents on the table, no laptops, no signs of business being conducted, only conversation. And something else, something quieter, more revealing. Ease. Gavin leaned forward when she spoke. Lila smiled in a way that wasn't performative. It was practiced but not forced. Their interaction lacked the tension of new acquaintance. This wasn't the beginning. Joanna remained where she was for exactly 6 minutes. She didn't need more. When she returned to her car, she opened her notebook. Client dinner. Inconsistent with observation. Location verified. Subject accompanied by L. Monroe. Behavior non-professional familiarity. She closed the notebook, placed it back in her bag, and drove home. She did not confront Gavin when he returned. When he walked through the door later that night, carrying the faint scent of cologne he hadn't worn that morning, Joanna greeted him the same way she always did, calm, composed, without accusation. "How was the dinner?" she asked. "Long," he replied. "Exhausting." She nodded once. "Get some rest." That was all. Gavin did not notice the absence of follow-up questions. He did not notice that Joanna no longer reacted to his explanations. He mistook her silence for acceptance. He had forgotten that silence could also mean documentation. Over the following weeks, Joanna expanded her records. Emails were the easiest, not because Gavin was careless, but because systems were predictable. Metadata, timestamps, routing paths, these things rarely lied. Joanna didn't need access to the content of every message. She needed patterns. She identified recurring exchanges between Gavin and Lila outside standard business hours. Messages sent minutes after meetings ended. Attachments that were never logged in official project folders. She archived what she could. Screenshots where necessary. Not obsessively, not excessively, just enough. Her approach was never about quantity. It was about clarity. One evening, while organizing financial summaries, Joanna noticed a minor inconsistency in the company's expense reporting. It was small, insignificant to most. A reimbursement filed under client engagement that didn't align with any documented meeting. She traced it. Then another, and another. Each tied back to Gavin's calendar. Each aligned with times Lila Monroe was present. Joanna didn't draw conclusions yet. She added another section to her notes. Expense irregularities. Cross-reference with L. Monroe schedule. The pieces were beginning to connect, but Joanna was not in a hurry to assemble them, because she understood something fundamental. Once evidence was used, it could not be reused. Timing mattered more than accumulation. Meanwhile, within the company, Lila's position began to evolve. Subtly at first. She was invited to higher-level meetings initially as support, then as a contributor. Her opinions carried increasing weight, often echoing Gavin's own perspectives, but with a refinement that made them more palatable. Some employees noticed. Most did not. Gavin introduced her to others as someone with potential, then as someone I trust. Eventually, he stopped qualifying the introductions altogether. Joanna observed all of it from a distance. She attended fewer company events. When she did appear, she remained peripheral, not withdrawn, but no longer central. Conversations shifted around her rather than through her. No one questioned it, because no one fully understood her role to begin with. That had always been intentional. One afternoon, while reviewing archived documents from the company's early years, Joanna revisited the original investment structure, the one that had saved Gavin's business when it was on the verge of collapse. Layered entities. Silent partners. The Cartwright Trust positioned at the center, invisible to anyone who didn't know how to read through the layers. She remembered the night she signed those documents. Gavin had been asleep in the next room, exhausted, unaware that his future was being stabilized without his knowledge. At the time, she had believed she was protecting him. Now she understood she had also been protecting something else. Control. Not over Gavin, over the truth. Back in the present, Joanna closed the file and placed it back exactly where she had found it. Her phone vibrated softly beside her. A message from Gavin. Running late again. Don't wait up. She read it once, then placed the phone face down. There was no reaction, no disappointment, only confirmation. Later that evening, she added one final note for the day. Pattern stabilized. Behavior consistent. External relationship confirmed. She paused for a moment, pen still in hand. Then she wrote one more line beneath it. No confrontation. Continue observation. Because Joanna Cartwright was not interested in exposing Gavin prematurely. Exposure without structure led to denial. Denial led to conflict. And conflict, when emotional, rarely produced outcomes that held. She was not preparing for an argument. She was preparing for something else. Something quieter. Something irreversible. And somewhere across the city, in a dimly lit restaurant where laughter replaced caution, Gavin Cartwright leaned closer to Lila Monroe, unaware that every step he took further into that relationship was being recorded, not emotionally, not impulsively, but precisely and permanently. He believed he was moving freely. He believed he was choosing his future. He did not yet understand that the future he was stepping into had already been documented, and that Joanna, in her silence, was not losing ground. She was defining it. Before the company had glass walls, before its name appeared in industry reports, before Gavin Cartwright learned how to speak like a man already successful, there had been a winter when everything nearly collapsed. It was not dramatic. There was no single catastrophic moment, no sudden bankruptcy filing, no public scandal. The decline had been quieter than that. A gradual tightening. Investors who began returning emails a little slower than, not at all. Joanna remembered it clearly. Not because Gavin had told her everything, but because he hadn't. He had started sleeping less. His tone sharpened in small ways. Conversations became shorter, more transactional. He insisted things were under control, even as the evidence suggested otherwise. At night, when he thought she was asleep, he would sit at the edge of the bed, scrolling through financial reports on his phone. Joanna never moved. She listened instead to the rhythm of his breathing, to the pauses between his movements. Stress had a sound, and Gavin was beginning to carry too much of it. The company at that time was not yet impressive. It was an idea trying to become structure, a logistics platform with potential but no stability. Revenue existed, but not enough. Growth projections had been optimistic. Too optimistic. Joanna reviewed the internal documents when he wasn't looking. She didn't need permission. She had never needed permission to understand numbers. Cash reserves declining. Accounts receivable delayed. Investor commitments uncertain. There was no immediate disaster, but there was no margin left for error either. Joanna did not confront him. Instead, she began mapping scenarios. Best case, a new investor enters within 30 days. Worst case, operational shutdown within 90. There were variations in between, but all of them shared one conclusion. Without intervention, Gavin's company would not survive the year. One evening, as snow collected in quiet layers outside their apartment windows, Gavin returned home later than usual. He didn't remove his coat immediately. He stood near the door for a moment, longer than necessary, as if deciding whether or not to say something. Joanna waited. He exhaled. I might need to restructure things, he said finally. Nothing serious. Just adjusting. She nodded once. Of course. He looked at her, searching for something, perhaps concern, perhaps reassurance. But Joanna offered neither, not because she didn't feel them, but because she understood that Gavin's pride would not accept either. He needed to believe he was still in control, so she allowed him to believe it. That night after he fell asleep, Joanna remained awake. She sat at her desk reviewing the documents again. not just the company's finances but her own. The Cartwright Trust had the capacity. That was never the question. The question was whether it should. Investment in her world was never emotional. It was calculated, structured, deliberate. Capital was not given, it was placed with conditions. But this was not a typical scenario. This was Gavin, her husband. And more than that, it was a test of something she had chosen to believe in. Joanna did not rush the decision. She spent 3 days reviewing everything, every liability, every projection, every possible outcome. She constructed models. She stress-tested assumptions. She treated Gavin's company the same way she would treat any potential acquisition. When she was finished, the conclusion was clear. The company was viable. Not as it was, but as it could be. And viability, when paired with control, was enough. Joanna contacted Margaret Hale the following morning. At that time, Margaret was not yet her lawyer. She was a specialist in corporate structuring, a name Joanna had known through reputation long before they ever spoke directly. Their conversation was efficient. "I need a structure that provides capital without visibility," Joanna said. Margaret did not ask unnecessary questions. "Control level," she replied. "Majority," Joanna answered. There was a pause. "Through layered entities, yes. Timeline immediate." Margaret understood. Within 48 hours, the framework began to take shape. It was precise. Multiple holding companies, each positioned to obscure direct ownership while maintaining legal clarity. The Cartwright Trust at the center, invisible but absolute. Voting rights secured. Decision-making authority embedded. To anyone reviewing the surface, it would appear as a consortium of private investors. To anyone who understood how to read deeper, it was singular. Joanna reviewed every document before signing. She made one adjustment. No disclosure, she added to the conditions. Margaret looked at her. Not even to him, Joanna's answer was immediate. No, it was not hesitation. It was intention. The funds were transferred within the week. Quietly. Efficiently. Irreversibly. Gavin discovered the investment through his own channels. A call from legal. A notification from finance. Joanna was in the kitchen when he came home that evening, energy returning to his movements in a way she had not seen in weeks. "We got it," he said, almost disbelieving. "An investment. Major." Joanna turned toward him. "That's good," she replied. He laughed, a short, relieved sound. "It's more than good. I don't even know how this happened." He moved through the room already, thinking ahead, already planning. "They didn't even push for control," he continued. "Just standard terms. It's he." Stopped shaking his head. "Timing like this doesn't happen." Joanna watched him. "Yes," she said softly. "It does." He didn't hear the difference in her tone. He didn't ask where the investment came from beyond the surface explanation. He didn't question the structure, the terms, the unusual absence of interference. He accepted it, because it aligned with what he wanted to believe. That his vision had been recognized, that his persistence had been rewarded, that success had found him because he deserved it. Joanna did not challenge that belief. At the time, she told herself it was a kindness. Let him build with confidence. Let him feel ownership. Let him stand in something he believed was entirely his. For a while it worked. The company stabilized. Then it grew. Opportunities expanded. New investors followed, unaware that the foundation beneath them was already controlled. Gavin adapted quickly. He learned how to present himself in rooms that once intimidated him. He spoke with authority, with assurance. His decisions became bolder. His risks larger. Joanna remained where she had always been. Present. Observant. Unseen, in the ways that mattered most. She did not attend every meeting. She did not insert herself into every decision. She allowed Gavin to operate, to lead, to believe. Because control, when absolute, did not need to be exercised constantly. It only needed to exist. Years passed. Success, layered over success. And somewhere along the way, Gavin stopped remembering what it had taken to get there. He no longer spoke about the early struggles, the near collapse, the uncertainty. He spoke instead about growth, about strategy, about expansion, as if those things had always been inevitable. Joanna noticed. But she did not correct him. Not then, because correction without necessity served no purpose. Now sitting alone in her study years later reviewing those same documents, Joanna understood the full weight of what she had done. She had not just saved his company, she had secured it entirely, and she had done so in a way that allowed Gavin to believe it was his. That belief had shaped him, had strengthened him, and eventually had blinded him. Joanna closed the final file and placed it back into its original position. The structure remained intact, unchanged, legally binding, undeniable. Everything Gavin believed he controlled, he did not, and everything Joanna had chosen not to reveal still belonged to her. She stood moving toward the window, looking out over a city that moved without pause. Somewhere within it, Gavin continued building a life that no longer included her in any meaningful way. He believed he had outgrown her, that she no longer understood his world, that she had become irrelevant to the success he now embodied. Joanna did not resent that belief. She recognized it, and more importantly, she understood what it would cost him, because the truth, when it finally surfaced, would not arrive as a revelation. It would arrive as documentation, signed, verified, enforced. And when that moment came, there would be no argument, only outcome. The invitation arrived on heavy cream paper embossed with a restraint that suggested power rather than celebration. Cartwright Logistics Annual Partnership Gala. Black tie required. Joanna held it for a moment, longer than necessary, her fingers resting along the edge as if measuring its weight. Not the paper itself, but what it represented. A public space, a controlled environment, a room where perception would matter more than truth. Gavin mentioned it that evening without looking up from his phone. "You'll come right?" he asked, his tone casual, almost distracted. Joanna was seated across from him at the dining table, her plate untouched. "Yes," she said. That was all. He nodded, already moving on to something else, another message, another thread of conversation she could not see but could easily imagine. Joanna did not ask who else would be attending. She already knew. The guest list had been circulated internally weeks earlier. She had reviewed it the same way she reviewed everything else, quietly, thoroughly, without drawing attention. Lila Monroe's name appeared not once, but twice. First under marketing leadership, then again under executive accompaniment. Joanna had noted the duplication. She had not commented on it. Instead, she wrote Gala. Dual listing L. Monroe. Public positioning shift. The days leading up to the event unfolded with a subtle but unmistakable change in tone. Gavin became more attentive, but not toward Joanna. Toward appearance. His suits were tailored again. His schedule cleared selectively. He spent longer in front of the mirror than usual adjusting details that once didn't matter to him, Joanna observed. There was no resentment in her expression, no visible reaction, only recognition. The shift was not about the event. It was about presentation, and presentation in Gavin's world had begun to replace substance. 3 nights before the gala, Joanna found a receipt in the kitchen left carelessly near the counter. It was for a boutique she knew well, not because she frequented it, but because it catered to a very specific type of clientele. The item listed was not subtle. Evening gown, custom fit, same-day alteration. The size was not hers. Joanna read the receipt once, then placed it back exactly where she found it. Later that night, she added a single line to her notes. Purchase, gown not mine. Timing pre-gala. Confirm association. She did not need confirmation, but confirmation, as always, would come. The morning of the gala arrived without ceremony. Gavin left early, citing preparation meetings, coordination with sponsors, final adjustments. His tone carried the familiar urgency he used to justify absence. Joanna did not question it. Instead, she moved through her own preparations with measured calm. Her dress had been chosen weeks earlier, not for impact, not for attention, but for clarity. It was understated, structured, intentional. The kind of presence that did not demand recognition but did not disappear either. She dressed slowly. Not out of hesitation, but out of precision. Every detail aligned, every choice deliberate. When she finished, she stood for a moment in front of the mirror, not to assess her appearance, but to confirm something else. Composure. It remained intact. That was enough. The ballroom was already filled when Joanna arrived. Conversations layered over one another in soft currents. Glasses touched lightly. Laughter rose and fell in practiced intervals. The lighting was warm, designed to flatter, to soften edges, to create the illusion of ease. Joanna stepped inside without hesitation. Some recognized her. Most did not. Those who did offered polite acknowledgments, nods, brief greetings, the kind of interactions reserved for someone whose presence was expected but no longer central. Joanna, one of the senior managers, said, his smile professional. "Good to see you." "You as well," she replied. No further conversation followed. That too was noted. She moved through the room with quiet awareness, her attention not fixed on any single point, but distributed, absorbing details, patterns, positioning. Where people stood, who spoke to whom, who avoided eye contact, and then she saw them. Gavin stood near the center of the room, exactly where he belonged, or where he believed he belonged. His posture was confident, his movements fluid, his presence commanding in a way that drew attention without effort. Beside him stood Lila Monroe. The gown matched the receipt. Black structure designed to be noticed without appearing excessive. It fit her precisely, as if it had been made for her, and perhaps it had. Their proximity was not accidental, not professional. It was intentional. And public. Joanna did not stop walking. She did not turn away. She approached them directly. Gavin noticed her a moment too late. There was a flicker, brief, almost imperceptible, of something in his expression. Not guilt, not surprise, adjustment. He stepped slightly away from Lila, just enough to create space, but not enough to redefine the dynamic. "Joanna," he said, his tone controlled. "You made it." "Yes," she replied. His eyes moved over her briefly, assessing, not admiring. "You look fine." It was not a compliment. It was a dismissal framed as one. Joanna accepted it without response. Lila smiled, then stepping forward with practiced ease. "Hi, I'm Lila," she said, extending her hand. "We haven't officially met." Joanna looked at her. There was no hesitation. "I know who you are," she said. Her tone was neutral, not cold, not warm, simply accurate. Lila's smile did not falter, but something behind it adjusted. Gavin cleared his throat lightly. "We were just discussing the campaign rollout," he said, as if re-establishing context would redefine reality. "Lila's been leading a lot of that." "I see," Joanna replied. She did not ask questions. She did not engage further. Because there was nothing to clarify. The room around them continued moving, conversations flowing, unaware or perhaps unwilling to acknowledge the subtle tension forming in that small space. Gavin shifted again, impatience beginning to surface. "You don't need to stay long if you're tired," he said. "It's going to be a late night." Joanna met his gaze. "I'm not tired." There was no challenge in her voice, only fact. He looked at her for a moment, longer than necessary, as if searching for something he could push against. He found nothing, and that absence unsettled him. Lila stepped in again, her tone light. "There's a seating arrangement for dinner," she said. "I think we're assigned together, Gavin. Not we all, just we." Joanna noted the language. Gavin nodded. "Right, I'll check on that." He didn't look at Joanna when he said it. He didn't need to. The message was clear. Positioning had been decided. Joanna inclined her head slightly. "Of course." She stepped back, not retreating, but disengaging. As she moved away, she could feel it. The shift in the room. Not loud, not obvious, but present. People noticed. They always did. They just rarely acknowledged it out loud. Joanna found her seat later, placed strategically at a table that allowed visibility without prominence. She sat, folded her hands lightly in her lap, and observed. Gavin and Lila were seated together, close, comfortable, public. The event progressed as expected. Speeches, announcements, applause. Gavin took the stage at one point, his voice steady, confident, carrying the authority he had cultivated over years. He spoke about growth, about resilience, about vision. Joanna listened, not to the words, but to what was missing. There was no mention of origins, no acknowledgement of the foundation that had made any of it possible. Only forward motion, only self-contained success. The room responded. They always did. Because success, when presented convincingly, rarely invites scrutiny. As the evening continued, the distance between Gavin and Joanna became more than physical. It became defined, visible, accepted. And then, near the end of the night, something shifted. It was small at first. A comment, a tone, a moment that would have passed unnoticed by most. But Joanna noticed. She always did. And in that moment she understood something with complete clarity. The line had already been crossed. What remained was simply the point at which it would be seen. The shift did not begin with the blow. It began with a sentence, quiet, almost careless, delivered in a tone that suggested it had been said before. Dinner had just concluded. Plates cleared. Glasses refilled. The room softened into that post-meal lull where conversations loosened and boundaries blurred. The lighting dimmed slightly, as if the evening were preparing to transition from formality into something less structured. Joanna remained seated, her posture unchanged, her attention steady. Across the table, Gavin leaned back in his chair, one arm draped along the backrest, his body angled not toward her but toward Lila. They had been speaking for several minutes, their voices low, their expressions relaxed. Others at the table had begun to disengage, sensing the subtle exclusivity of their exchange. Joanna did not interrupt. She listened. "It just needs someone who understands how things actually work," Gavin was saying. "Not theory, not abstraction." Lila nodded, her expression attentive. "Exactly," she replied. "Execution matters more than intention." Gavin smiled slightly. "That's the problem," he continued. "Some people think proximity equals contribution." There was a pause. Not long, but long enough. And then his eyes shifted, not fully, just enough, toward Joanna. The table fell into a silence that no one acknowledged. Joanna met his gaze. She did not look away. "What do you mean?" she asked. Her voice was even, measured, not confrontational. Gavin exhaled lightly, as if the question itself were unnecessary. "I mean," he said, his tone sharpening just slightly, "that being around something doesn't mean you understand it." Lila remained still, her expression carefully neutral. Joanna considered his words. "Not emotionally, structurally." "You're right," she said. There was no irony in her tone, no resistance, just agreement. And that more than anything unsettled him, because there was nothing to push against. Gavin leaned forward, then placing his glass down with more force than required. "You've been absent," he continued. "Disconnected. This company, it's not something you can just observe from a distance." The word observe lingered. He meant it as criticism. Joanna heard it as confirmation. "I've been present," she replied. "Not in any way that matters," he said quickly. Too quickly. The shift in his voice drew attention now. Nearby conversations slowed. Not stopped, but softened. Joanna remained still. "What would you consider mattering?" she asked. Gavin laughed. A short, dismissive sound. "Understanding the business," he said. "Being involved, contributing, not just," he gestured vaguely, "existing on the sidelines." Lila shifted slightly beside him, her hand brushing the edge of the table. "Gavin," she began. He didn't look at her. "I'm just being honest," he said. Honesty. He used the word as justification, as if clarity erased consequence. Joanna watched him. There was no anger in her expression, no visible reaction at all, only attention. "You think I don't understand the business," she said. It was not a question. Gavin held her gaze. "I think," he replied, choosing his words more deliberately now, "that you've never really been part of it." The sentence settled into the space between them. Heavy, final, irreversible. At another time, another version of herself, Joanna might have responded differently. She might have corrected him, might have reminded him of the early days, the late nights, the documents reviewed, the decisions influenced quietly from the background. But that version of her no longer served a purpose, so she did not speak, and her silence again was misinterpreted. Gavin leaned back, interpreting the absence of response as concession. "You don't have to take it personally," he added. "It's just reality." Reality, another word he used as a shield. Lila's voice entered again, softer this time. "Maybe we should," but she didn't finish, because something in Gavin had already moved beyond restraint. The alcohol had not caused it. It had only removed the final layer that kept it contained. Joanna shifted slightly in her chair. Not away, not back, just enough to recenter herself. And then she spoke. "You're right about one thing," she said. Gavin looked at her, curious, expecting resistance, expecting emotion. He found neither. "Reality does matter, Joanna continued. There was a pause, and in that pause something changed. Not in the room, in him. Because her tone did not align with submission. It aligned with certainty. And certainty, when it did not belong to him, unsettled him. "What is that supposed to mean?" he asked. Joanna held his gaze. "It means," she said quietly, "that understanding something doesn't always require being seen." The words were simple, but they carried weight he could not immediately define. Gavin's expression hardened. "That's exactly what I mean," he said, his voice rising slightly. "You hide behind that. Observation. Distance. Like it's some kind of contribution." Now, the surrounding tables were listening. Not openly, but enough. Joanna remained composed. "I don't hide," she said. Gavin leaned forward again. "No," he said. "Then what do you call this?" "Sitting here saying nothing, doing nothing. I do what is necessary," she interrupted. It was the first time she had cut him off. Her voice was not louder, but it was firmer. And that, more than volume, shifted the dynamic. Gavin's jaw tightened. "Necessary," he repeated. "You wouldn't know what necessary looks like." The sentence came out sharper than intended, and once spoken, it could not be withdrawn. Joanna looked at him for a long moment, not wounded, not surprised, just seeing. "You're right," she said. Again. Agreement. Again. And again it disarmed him, because he was not arguing with her. He was reacting to something he did not understand. And that lack of understanding turned into frustration. Frustration into anger. And anger into action. It happened quickly, too quickly for the room to process. Gavin stood. The chair scraped against the floor, a sharp sound that cut through the ambient noise. Joanna did not move. "Not yet." "What you are," he said, his voice no longer controlled, "is dead weight." The words landed before the silence could. Someone nearby shifted. Another looked away. No one intervened. Lila stood halfway, her hand lifting slightly. "Gavin, stop." But he didn't, because in that moment he was no longer aware of the room, only of the pressure building inside him. And Joanna, still seated, still calm, still not reacting. That, more than anything, was what broke him. His hand moved before thought could catch it. A single motion. Fast. Direct. The sound was not loud, but it carried. Through the room, through the silence that followed. Joanna's head turned slightly with the impact. Her body shifted just enough to absorb it, but she did not fall. She did not cry out. She did not raise her hand in defense. She remained seated. Still, the room froze. Conversations stopped. Glasses paused mid-air. Someone inhaled sharply. Another person reached for their phone. Lila stepped back, her face pale, her expression no longer controlled. "Gavin," she whispered. He was breathing heavily now, not from exertion, from something else, something that had already crossed a line he could not see clearly anymore. Joanna slowly turned her head back to center. Her hand did not rise to her face. She did not check for damage. She did not acknowledge the pain. Instead, she looked around the room, one face at a time, not accusing, not pleading, observing, recording, every reaction, every absence of reaction, every person who chose stillness over intervention. And then she stood, not abruptly, not dramatically, just stood. The room made space for her without being asked. She adjusted nothing, said nothing, looked at no one directly, except briefly at Gavin. Not with anger, not with sorrow, but with something far more final, recognition. And then she walked away. No one stopped her. No one spoke. Behind her, the room remained suspended in that moment, between what had happened and what it would mean. And somewhere in the quiet aftermath, as a phone continued recording what no one had prevented, the consequences began. The hallway outside the ballroom was quieter than it should have been. Soundproofing, Joanna noted. Intentional. Designed to contain what happened inside. The doors closed behind her with a softness that felt almost inappropriate, as if the building itself had decided that whatever had just occurred did not belong beyond those walls. Joanna walked without hesitation. Her pace was steady, measured, not hurried. There was no visible urgency in her movement, no outward sign that anything had just changed. Her hand did not rise to her face. She did not check for swelling, for pain, for damage. Not yet, because the moment for her had already passed. What remained was what came next. She reached the elevator before anyone followed, or perhaps no one intended to. That too was information. When the doors opened, she stepped inside alone. The mirrored walls reflected her from multiple angles, composed upright, unchanged in posture. Only one detail disrupted the image: a faint redness along her cheek. It would darken later. She knew that, but for now it was subtle enough to be dismissed, if anyone chose to dismiss it. Joanna pressed the button for the lobby. The doors closed. Silence settled. And for the first time since the impact, she allowed herself to register the physical sensation. Not pain. Not exactly. More like pressure. A dull, contained awareness that something had occurred. She inhaled once. Slow. Controlled. Then exhaled. The elevator descended. Floor by floor. Without interruption. Her phone vibrated softly in her bag. Once. Then again. She did not check it, because she already knew who it would be. Gavin. And she knew what it would contain. Not an apology. Not yet. Explanation perhaps. Justification. Or silence disguised as concern. She did not need to read it to understand it. When the doors opened, Joanna stepped into the lobby. The atmosphere here was different. Unaware. Unchanged. Guests moved through the space with the same casual rhythm, untouched by what had happened above them. Joanna walked past them without drawing attention. Outside, the night air was colder than expected. It met her skin with clarity. She paused for a moment near the curb, not waiting, not searching, just standing. Then she reached into her bag and retrieved her phone. 3 messages. All from Gavin. She opened them in order. "Where did you go?" A pause. "Joanna, don't do this." Another. "We need to talk." She read them once. Then locked the screen. There was nothing in those messages that required a response. Not now. A car approached. Not one she had called. The driver stepped out, opening the rear door. "Mrs. Cartwright?" he asked. Joanna nodded. Of course, Gavin had arranged transportation. For appearance, for convenience, for control. She entered the car without comment. The door closed behind her. As the vehicle pulled away, Joanna looked out the window, not at the city, not at the passing lights, but at the reflection of herself in the glass. Still composed, still quiet, still present, but something had shifted. Not in her demeanor, in her position, because what had happened in that ballroom was no longer private. It had not been contained. Not truly. Someone had recorded it. She had seen the phone. Angle slightly raised, timing precise. Not accidental. That mattered. Back at the apartment, the silence was complete. No movement, no presence. Joanna removed her shoes at the door, placing them neatly beside each other. Routine. Structure. She walked to the bathroom and turned on the light. The mirror reflected her clearly now. The redness had deepened, a faint outline forming beneath the surface. She studied it. Not emotionally, clinically. Extent, location, impact. She reached out, touching the edge of it lightly. There was sensitivity. Expected. No visible swelling yet. That would come. She opened the cabinet and removed a small kid ice pack antiseptic gauze. Not because she believed it was necessary, but because preparation was. As she pressed the cold against her skin, she reached for something else. Her notebook. It remained where she had left it earlier that evening. She opened to a new page. For a moment she did not write. Not because she hesitated, because she was choosing language. Precision mattered. Then carefully she began gala event. 9:42 p.m. Physical assault. Public setting. Multiple witnesses present. No intervention. She paused. Then added video recording. Observed unidentified source. Another pause. Then verbal statements preceding incident. Documented. She closed the notebook. Not because she was finished. Because the record had begun. And once begun, it would continue. Her phone vibrated again. This time she answered. Not immediately, but without delay. Joanna Gavin's voice came through tighter, now less controlled than before. "Where are you, home?" she replied. A pause. He exhaled. "Why did you leave like that?" he asked. "You embarrassed me." The sentence settled between them. Joanna did not respond right away, not because she didn't have an answer, because she was allowing him to define his position. "I embarrassed you," she repeated. "Yes," he said quickly. "You just walked out. In the middle of everything. People were asking questions. Not about the incident, about her. That was what concerned him." Joanna noted it. "I see," she said. Another pause. Then his tone shifted slightly. "Look," he added, "what happened? It got out of hand. Out of hand. As if it had slipped. As if it had not been a choice." "It did," Joanna said. He waited. For more. For reaction. For something he could respond to. It did not come. "Are you okay?" he asked finally. The question arrived late. And without weight. "I am," she replied. "Good," he said almost too quickly. "Then we can just move past this. No need to make it bigger than it is." Joanna closed her eyes for a brief moment. Not in frustration, in clarity, because now everything aligned. "Gavin," she said. "Yes, we won't be moving past this." Silence. Not long, but enough. "What does that mean?" he asked. "It means," Joanna said evenly, "that what happened tonight will be addressed." His tone sharpened immediately. Addressed how she did not answer that question. Not directly. "Good night, Gavin," she said, and ended the call. The apartment returned to silence. Complete. Undisturbed. Joanna placed the phone down and returned to the mirror. The mark on her face had begun to darken. Visible now. Undeniable. She did not hide it. She did not cover it. Because it was no longer something to be concealed. It was evidence, and evidence had value. Across the city, in a hotel room where the aftermath had not yet settled, Gavin Cartwright was still speaking, still explaining, still reshaping the narrative in ways that preserved his position. He did not yet understand that the narrative no longer belonged to him, because somewhere on a device he did not control a recording existed. And in Joanna's possession, documentation had already begun. And in the space between those two things, a process had started. Not emotional, not reactive. Legal. Structured. Inevitable. Joanna turned off the bathroom light and stepped into the quiet of her home. Not as someone recovering, but as someone preparing. Joanna did not contact a lawyer immediately. Not because she hesitated, but because timing in matters of consequence was never impulsive. It required alignment. Evidence had to exist not only in fragments but in structure. By morning, the mark on her cheek had darkened into something more defined. It no longer suggested possibility, it confirmed fact. She stood in front of the mirror briefly, not assessing damage but documenting progression. The discoloration followed a predictable pattern. The angle, the force, the contact point, all consistent. She took one photograph, then another from a different angle. No filters, no edits, time-stamped, stored. Then she moved on. Her routine did not change. Breakfast was prepared but left untouched. Coffee brewed but only half consumed. The apartment remained as orderly as it had been the night before. There was no disruption, only continuation. At 9:12 a.m., Joanna made the call. Margaret Hale's office. The voice was professional neutral. "This is Joanna Cartwright," she said. "I'd like to schedule a meeting." There was a pause. Recognition subtle but present. "Of course, Mrs. Cartwright. Miss Hale is available this afternoon at 2. I'll be there." Margaret Hale's office was located on the 32nd floor of a building that did not advertise its tenants. Discretion, like everything else in that space, was assumed. Joanna arrived 5 minutes early. Not out of politeness, out of consistency. The receptionist greeted her with quiet efficiency and guided her into a conference room where nothing was left to chance. Clean lines, neutral tones, a space designed to hold conversations that mattered. Margaret entered exactly at 2. She did not rush. She did not hesitate. Her presence was composed, deliberate, shaped by years of navigating conflicts, where emotion often obscured truth. "Joanna," she said, taking a seat across from her. "It's been a long time." "It has," Joanna replied. Margaret's eyes moved briefly to Joanna's face. She noticed the mark. Of course she did, but she did not comment on it immediately. That too was discipline. "What do you need?" Margaret asked. Joanna placed her phone on the table, then her notebook, then a folder. Each item aligned precisely. "I need to initiate a structured response," Joanna said. Margaret leaned back slightly. "Define." "Structured." Joanna opened the folder. Inside were documents organized, labeled chronological. "Physical assault," she said calmly. "Public setting. Multiple witnesses. Recorded." Margaret's expression did not change, but her attention sharpened. When she asked, "Last night, 9:42 p.m." Margaret nodded once. "Continue." Joanna slid a photograph across the table, time-stamped, clear. Margaret looked at it briefly, then returned it without comment. "Medical documentation," she asked. "Pending," Joanna replied. "Appointment scheduled for later today." "Good." Margaret's tone remained even. Professional. But beneath it there was movement. Not emotional. Strategic. "What else?" she asked. Joanna opened the notebook. "Preceding behavior documented over several months," she said. "Verbal statements. Pattern of conduct. Financial irregularities connected to a third party." Margaret's eyes lifted. "Third party, Lila Monroe," Joanna replied. "Recognition?" Employee Margaret asked. "Yes. And your husband's involvement?" "Consistent. Verifiable." Margaret exhaled softly. "Not in surprise. In calculation." "Do you have documentation?" she asked. Joanna slid another set of papers forward. "Emails, time logs, expense reports, all cross-referenced." Margaret reviewed them quickly, efficiently. She did not need to read every line. She needed to understand the structure. "And ownership?" she asked after a moment. Joanna met her gaze. Unchanged, that was all. Margaret held her eyes for a second longer, then nodded. "Still majority, yes. Through the original structure, yes." Margaret leaned back. Now she understood the full scope, not just the incident, but the leverage. "You've been preparing," she said. It was not a question. "No," Joanna replied. "I've been documenting." Margaret allowed a faint acknowledgement. "Same outcome," she said. Joanna did not respond, because outcome in her view was still in motion. "What do you want?" Margaret asked. It was the first time the question had shifted from facts to intention. Joanna did not answer immediately. Not because she didn't know. Because she was choosing precision. "I want control to be enforced," she said. Margaret nodded. And personally, Joanna's expression did not change. "Separation," she said. "Clear. Final." Margaret accepted that without comment. "Then we proceed on 2 tracks," she said. "Corporate and personal." She reached for a legal pad and began outlining. "Corporate we call a board meeting. Present ownership structure. Introduce evidence of misconduct, both financial and behavioral." She paused. "Video will be critical." "I don't have it yet," Joanna said. "You will," Margaret replied. It was not optimism. It was expectation. "Personal we file for divorce," she continued. "Grounds include abuse, financial misconduct, and breach of fiduciary duty." Joanna listened, not reacting, only absorbing. "We also secure your position," Margaret added. "Freeze certain accounts if necessary. Prevent asset movement." Joanna nodded once. "Timing?" she asked. Margaret considered. "Soon," she said, "but not rushed. We need the video and medical documentation. Once we have both, we move." Joanna closed the folder. There was nothing else to add. The framework had formed. Margaret leaned forward slightly. "One more question," she said. Joanna looked at her. "Why didn't you tell him?" Margaret asked. "About the ownership. From the beginning." It was not criticism. It was curiosity. Joanna held her gaze. "Because he needed to believe it was his," she said. Margaret studied her for a moment, and now Joanna's answer was quiet. "Now it matters that it isn't." Margaret nodded. There was no judgment in it, only understanding. The meeting concluded without ceremony. No dramatic statements, no emotional closure, only decisions. As Joanna left the office, the city outside continued as it always did, unaware, uninterrupted. But within the structures she had just set in motion, something had shifted, irreversibly. Across town, Gavin sat in his office, unaware of the exact sequence unfolding against him, but not entirely unaware that something had changed. The calls he made were not returned as quickly. The tone in meetings had adjusted slightly but noticeably. And somewhere within the company a video existed, circulating quietly, not public, not yet, but moving. And in a law office 32 floors above the street, a case had begun to take shape, not as accusation, not as reaction, but as structure. Evidence aligned, authority defined, outcome approaching. Joanna stepped into the elevator, her reflection steady in the mirrored walls. No visible urgency, no outward change. But beneath that stillness, control had shifted. And this time, it would not remain invisible. By the beginning of the following week, the company had not yet changed in any way that could be formally identified. And yet the shift was already present, quiet, unannounced, but steadily shaping the behavior of those who knew how to recognize it. It did not appear in reports, nor in performance metrics, nor in any measurable decline in operations. On the surface, everything remained intact. Meetings proceeded as scheduled. Departments functioned. Emails were answered. Deadlines were met. But beneath that surface, something had begun to loosen. It revealed itself first not in decisions, but in hesitation. Employees who had once spoken freely in Gavin's presence now chose their words more carefully. Agreement, which had once been immediate and reflexive, now carried a slight delay, just long enough to be felt, though not long enough to be questioned outright. Eye contact shifted. Conversations redirected. Small pauses entered spaces where certainty had once existed. None of it was explicit. And yet to those who paid attention, it was unmistakable. Gavin noticed the change, but he interpreted it through the only framework he trusted: control. In his view, inconsistency was something to be corrected, not understood. He attributed the altered atmosphere to pressure, to growth, to the natural strain of expansion. It did not occur to him that the cause might be something less visible and far less manageable. Because the video had already begun to circulate, not publicly, not in any formal or traceable way, but through the quiet channels that exist within every organization. Private messages, forwarded files, conversations that took place just beyond the reach of authority. It moved slowly, deliberately, almost cautiously, as if those who shared it understood its weight and chose not to mishandle it. Those who received it rarely discussed it aloud. They watched often, more than once, and then made a decision, whether to keep it, to delete it, or to pass it forward. Most chose to keep it. Some chose to share it. Very few chose to ignore it entirely, because what it contained did not invite interpretation. It did not require context. It simply showed what had happened. And once seen, it altered perception in a way that could not be easily reversed. Within the executive level, however, the shift remained contained, though no less present. Gavin continued to operate as he always had, maintaining the structure that had once reinforced his authority. His meetings were precise, his directives clear, his expectations unchanged. He spoke with the same confidence, made decisions with the same immediacy, and moved through the company with the same assumption of control. But control, when no longer fully accepted, begins to feel different even to the one who holds it. That difference appeared most clearly during a financial review meeting early that week. Ethan Brooks, the company's chief financial officer, had built his career on consistency, on numbers that aligned, projections that held, and decisions that could be traced back to data rather than impulse. He was not prone to speculation nor to unnecessary intervention, but he was attentive, and he understood that irregularities rarely appeared all at once. They emerged gradually, often disguised as minor deviations that over time formed a pattern. He had begun to see that pattern, not only in the financial records but in the structure of decision-making itself. Lila Monroe was present at the meeting. That in itself was no longer unusual. What had changed was the role she occupied. She no longer sat at the edge of the table as a contributor within her department. Instead, she positioned herself closer to the center, speaking not only on matters of marketing, but on operational strategy and resource allocation areas that extended beyond her formal responsibilities. She spoke with confidence, her tone measured, her arguments structured just enough to appear grounded, though not always fully supported by the data she referenced. "If we adjust the allocation here," she said, indicating a section of the report, "we can increase short-term engagement without compromising long-term stability." Ethan reviewed the figures in front of him, his expression unchanged. The numbers did not contradict her entirely, but they did not support her conclusion, with the certainty she implied. Based on current liquidity, he replied evenly, that adjustment would introduce a higher level of exposure than we've previously accepted. Lila did not hesitate. That assumes current patterns remain fixed, she said. They won't. It was a confident answer. Perhaps too confident. Ethan glanced briefly at Gavin. Gavin did not look at him. She's right, Gavin said, his tone final in a way that closed the discussion before it had fully developed. There was no further debate. The decision was made, and in that moment Ethan recognized something that could not be reduced to numbers alone. The process had shifted, not dramatically, not yet, but enough. He made no comment, nor did he challenge the decision further. Instead, he noted it mentally first, then later in a private record he maintained outside the company's official systems. Because decisions like financial discrepancies rarely existed in isolation. They accumulated. And accumulation, when examined carefully, revealed intent. After the meeting, Ethan remained behind for a few moments, organizing his documents with deliberate precision. It gave him time to observe without appearing to do so. Gavin and Lila continued their conversation after the others had left. The tone changed almost immediately, less formal, more familiar. There was no clear boundary between professional discussion and something else, something more personal, though still restrained enough to avoid direct exposure. Ethan did not listen to the content of their words. He did not need to. Proximity, posture, and timing provided enough information. He left the room without acknowledgement. But the pattern had become clearer. Throughout the company, similar observations were forming, though few expressed them directly. A department head noticed that Lila now attended meetings unrelated to her role. An assistant observed that calendar entries were being adjusted without standard protocol. An HR manager began to question informal shifts in authority that had not been documented or approved. Individually, these details could be dismissed. Together, they suggested something more significant. At the same time, Joanna's absence began to take on a different kind of presence. She was no longer seen in hallways, nor at meetings, nor at events where she had once been quietly acknowledged. And yet her name remained embedded within the company's structure, in documents, in ownership records, in legal frameworks that few understood but all were bound by. Her absence did not remove her influence. It clarified it. In Margaret Hale's office, the preparation continued with methodical precision. Medical documentation had been secured, detailing the injury in clinical terms that left no room for reinterpretation. The timeline of events had been reconstructed not only from Joanna's records, but from external confirmations, timestamps, communications, and soon, the video itself. Margaret did not rush the process. She understood that strength in a legal context came not from speed, but from structure. We don't need to present everything she said during one of their meetings. We need to present what cannot be dismissed, Joanna agreed. Excess diluted clarity. Precision enforced it. Meanwhile, the video reached its first point of institutional awareness. A member of the board received it not through official channels but through a private communication accompanied by no explanation, only a question, "Have you seen this?" He watched it once, then again, not because he needed confirmation of what it showed, but because he needed to understand what it meant. Not for Gavin alone, for the company, for liability, for risk. He did not act immediately. Instead, he shared it quietly with another board member, then another. Each viewing added weight, not through discussion, but through recognition. Gavin at this point remained outside that awareness. He sensed the shift, but not its source. And so he responded in the only way he knew how, by tightening control. More oversight, more direct involvement, more insistence on alignment. But control, when applied without understanding, often reveals the very instability it is meant to suppress. And that instability was no longer confined to perception. It was becoming structure. In her apartment, Joanna reviewed the latest documents Margaret had compiled. There was no visible reaction in her expression, no sense of satisfaction or anticipation, only acknowledgement, because what was unfolding was neither unexpected nor accelerated. It was proceeding exactly as it should. The board had not yet been formally convened. No announcement had been made. No confrontation had taken place. And yet the movement toward all of it was already in motion, quietly, inevitably. Each piece, every record, every decision, every silence had begun to align. And once aligned, they would not require force to hold. Only presentation. By the time Ethan Brooks began his deeper review, he did not approach it as an investigation. He approached it as verification. There was a distinction, and to him it mattered. An investigation assumed wrongdoing and sought to prove it. Verification, on the other hand, began with patterns, small inconsistencies that, when examined closely, either dissolved into acceptable variance or consolidated into something that required acknowledgement. Ethan preferred the latter. It allowed the facts to speak without interference. He started with the expense reports, not because they were the most obvious place to look, but because they were the least guarded. Financial records, when processed through routine systems, tended to reveal more than intended. They were structured to appear orderly, but beneath that structure they carried traces of behavior, choices, priorities, deviations. He selected a time frame that aligned with what he had already observed the past 3 months, the period during which Lila Monroe's presence had shifted. At first, the entries appeared ordinary: client dinners, travel reimbursements, marketing-related expenditures. Each categorized, each approved, each processed through the appropriate channels. But Ethan was not looking for what was obvious. He was looking for what did not align. He adjusted the filters, removed standard thresholds, cross-referenced entries with calendar data. Patterns began to form. Not immediately, but gradually. A dinner categorized under client engagement with no corresponding client listed in the CRM system. A series of rideshare charges that originated from the office but ended at locations unrelated to any registered business partner. Hotel bookings that overlapped with internal meetings that required no travel. Individually, each could be explained. Together, they required examination. Ethan did not draw conclusions. He documented: date, amount, category, discrepancy. Then he moved to the next layer: approval chains. Most expenses required secondary authorization above a certain threshold. In a company of this size, those approvals were typically distributed across departments to ensure accountability. But in this case, several entries had been approved directly by Gavin. That in itself was not unusual. What was unusual was the frequency and the lack of accompanying notes. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, considering. It was not uncommon for executives to expedite approvals. Efficiency often required it, but efficiency usually left traces, comments, justifications, at the very least a brief acknowledgement of deviation. Here there was none. He opened another file: bank transfer logs, internal allocations, movement between accounts. Again, nothing immediately irregular, but when viewed alongside the expense reports, a pattern began to sharpen. Funds were being redirected, not in large amounts, not in ways that would trigger automatic alerts, but consistently, small reallocations, repeated over time, each one positioned just below the threshold that required additional scrutiny. Ethan recognized the structure. It was not accidental. He did not yet label it. He did not need to. He saved the data. Then he opened a separate document, his own, a private record, one that existed outside the company's systems. He began to compile. Not every entry, only those that formed a clear line when connected, because clarity, not volume, would determine what mattered. Later that afternoon, he requested access to archived calendar data. It was within his authority. No justification required. The system provided what he needed: schedules, appointments, adjustments. He aligned them with the financial records. The pattern held. Entries marked as client meetings corresponded with expenses that had no client attached. Time blocks labeled as internal review overlapped with off-site transactions. And, increasingly, one name appeared alongside those entries. Not always explicitly, but often enough: Lila Monroe. Ethan closed the file, not because he was finished, because he had seen enough to confirm what he had suspected. There was a connection, structured, repeated, and unlikely to be incidental. He did not confront Gavin. Not yet. Because confrontation without preparation rarely produced clarity. It produced resistance. Instead, he requested a brief meeting, scheduled for the following morning. Subject line: financial alignment review. Neutral. Non-confrontational. Gavin accepted. Of course he did. The next morning, Ethan arrived early. Not to prepare. He already had. But to ensure that the environment remained controlled. The conference room was quiet, uninterrupted. When Gavin entered, his demeanor was unchanged, confident, composed, carrying the authority that had defined him for years. "Ethan," he said, taking a seat. "What's this about?" Ethan placed a folder on the table, not sliding it forward. "Not yet. I wanted to review a few recent allocations," he said. Gavin nodded. "Go ahead." Ethan opened the folder. Over the past 3 months, he began, there have been several expense entries categorized under client engagement that do not correspond with any recorded client activity. Gavin leaned back slightly. "That happens," he said. "Not everything goes through the system perfectly." Ethan acknowledged the point. "It can," he said, "but the frequency here suggests a pattern." Gavin's expression remained neutral. "Are you saying there's a problem?" Ethan met his gaze. "I'm saying there's a discrepancy." A pause. Not long, but enough to register. Gavin exhaled. "Then fix it," he said. "That's your job." Ethan did not react to the dismissal. "Some of these entries were approved directly by you," he continued. Gavin's eyes sharpened slightly. "I approve a lot of things," he replied. "Yes," Ethan said. "But these lack supporting documentation." Gavin leaned forward now, his tone tightening. "Are you questioning my approvals?" Ethan did not raise his voice. "I'm asking for clarification." Another pause. Longer this time. Gavin held his gaze, then looked away briefly. "They were valid," he said. "That's all you need to know." Ethan considered that, then nodded once. "For internal compliance," he said, "I'll need to document that clarification." Gavin's jaw tightened. "Do what you need to do," he said. The meeting ended shortly after. No resolution, no escalation. But something had shifted. Because for the first time, the pattern had been acknowledged, if only indirectly. And once acknowledged, it could not be fully contained. Outside the room, the company continued as it always had. But beneath that continuity, alignment was forming. The financial records, the behavioral patterns, the internal observations, and elsewhere, the legal structure. In Margaret Hale's office, the final pieces were being assembled. The video had been obtained, clear, undeniable, time-stamped. It would not need explanation, only presentation. Joanna reviewed it once, not to relive the moment, but to confirm its integrity. She closed the file without comment. Margaret watched her. "You're ready," she said. Joanna did not respond immediately. Then, "Yes," she said, not with emphasis, not with emotion, just certainty. The board meeting had been scheduled. Officially, formally. Attendance required. No indication of what would be presented. No suggestion of what would unfold. But within the documents already in place, within the records already aligned, within the evidence already secured, the outcome had begun to take shape, not as possibility, but as structure. And once structure existed, it would not need force to hold, only recognition. By the time the board meeting was formally scheduled, the company had already begun to adjust to a reality that had not yet been publicly acknowledged. No announcement had been made. No internal memo had circulated. There was no official indication that anything beyond routine governance was about to take place. And yet the awareness existed. Not as certainty, but as anticipation. It moved through the organization in the same way the video had quietly, without attribution, carried by those who understood that some information did not need to be explained in order to be understood. At the executive level, that awareness took on a more defined shape. The board members who had seen the footage did not discuss it openly, but their communication shifted in ways that suggested alignment. Calls were made with greater frequency. Emails were shorter, more direct. Questions were framed not as hypotheticals, but as preparations. Legal exposure, reputational risk, governance, responsibility. Each of these terms began to appear not as concerns, but as factors that required structure. Gavin, for his part, remained positioned at the center of the company's operations, but the space around him had changed. It was not visible in any single interaction, but it could be felt. Responses to his directives came with a slight delay. Agreement, once immediate, now required confirmation. Conversations that had previously flowed with ease now carried a subtle caution, as though each participant were measuring not only what was being said but how it might later be interpreted. Gavin recognized the change, but he attributed it to resistance. He believed that growth always introduced friction, that leadership required reinforcement, and that any deviation from alignment could be corrected through increased control. So he adjusted accordingly. He scheduled additional meetings. He requested more frequent reporting. He inserted himself into decisions that had previously been delegated. From his perspective, he was reinforcing structure. In reality, he was revealing instability. Lila Monroe adapted to this shift with careful precision. She adjusted her tone in meetings, positioning herself as supportive rather than directive. Where she had previously spoken with confidence, she now allowed Gavin to lead more visibly, reinforcing his authority while maintaining her proximity to it. To an outside observer, the dynamic might have appeared balanced. To those who had seen the video, it appeared calculated, because the association between them was no longer a matter of speculation. It had been contextualized. And context, once established, altered perception in ways that could not be undone. Ethan Brooks continued his review without interruption. He did not escalate his findings immediately, nor did he present them beyond the scope required by his role. Instead, he refined them, removing any element that could be challenged, any assumption that could be dismissed. What remained was not a theory. It was a structure, a sequence of financial decisions that, when viewed collectively, demonstrated a pattern of personal use of corporate resources. Not excessive, not dramatic, but consistent. And consistency in matters of this nature carried more weight than magnitude. He prepared a summary, not detailed, not expansive, but precise, because in a room where decisions would be made, clarity would matter more than volume. Meanwhile, in Margaret Hale's office, the preparation reached its final stage. The documentation had been reviewed, the timeline confirmed, the legal framework aligned with the evidence in a way that left little room for reinterpretation. Margaret did not speak in terms of certainty. She spoke in terms of position. We don't need to prove everything, she said during their final meeting before the board convened. We need to establish enough that the board cannot ignore the implications. Joanna listened without interruption. She had no questions, because the objective had never changed. Not from the moment she began documenting, not from the moment she chose not to confront. Control, not as reaction, but as structure. The video, now secured within their materials, remained the most direct element of that structure. It did not require explanation. It did not invite debate. It simply existed, and in its existence it redefined the narrative that Gavin had attempted to maintain. Joanna had watched it only once. That had been sufficient. She did not need to revisit it, because for her the moment it captured had already been processed. Not emotionally, but factually. The board meeting was scheduled for Thursday morning. Attendance mandatory. Agenda: executive review and governance alignment. No further detail provided. Gavin received the notice the same way the others did. He reviewed it briefly, his expression unchanged. Board meetings were routine, necessary, predictable. He had attended dozens. He expected nothing different. If anything, he anticipated an opportunity to reinforce his position, to address whatever minor concerns had begun to circulate, and to re-establish the clarity of his authority. He did not consider the possibility that the meeting had been structured for a different purpose, because to consider that would require acknowledging something he had not yet allowed himself to see: that the company he believed he controlled was no longer aligned behind him. On the morning of the meeting, the building carried a different kind of silence. Not absence of sound, but absence of ease. Employees moved through the space with the same routines, but with an awareness that something was about to occur, something that extended beyond their immediate roles. At the executive level, that awareness was more focused. Board members arrived early, not out of necessity, out of intention. They took their seats with a composure that suggested preparation rather than curiosity. Documents were placed in front of them. Not many, but enough. Ethan was present, his summary prepared, his role clear. Margaret Hale entered the room shortly before the meeting began. Her presence was noted, though not questioned. Legal counsel in this context was not unusual, but the timing of her presence, that carried meaning. Joanna arrived last, not by accident, but by design. She entered the room without hesitation, her posture unchanged, her expression composed in a way that did not invite interpretation. Some recognized her immediately. Others took a moment longer, but all in that moment understood that her presence was not incidental. It was central. Gavin looked at her as she took her seat. There was no greeting, no acknowledgement beyond the brief recognition that passed between them. But something in his expression shifted. Not fully, not yet, but enough to register. Because for the first time since the gala, Joanna had returned. Not as a participant, but as something else. The meeting was called to order. Formalities were observed, minutes acknowledged, procedures followed, all of it proceeding as expected. Until it didn't. Margaret was the one who introduced the shift. "Before we proceed with the standard agenda," she said, her tone, even her delivery precise, "there are matters that require immediate review." The room remained still, not surprised, but attentive. Gavin turned slightly in his chair. "What matters?" he asked. Margaret did not look at him immediately. Instead, she placed a document on the table, then another. Ownership structure, trust documentation, legal confirmation. Then she spoke. "Matters concerning control," she said. The words settled into the room with quiet weight, and in that moment, before any evidence was presented, before any conclusion was stated, before the full structure was revealed, the direction of the meeting changed. Irreversibly. The word control did not provoke an immediate reaction. It did not need to. In a room where authority was assumed rather than questioned, the introduction of that single term, placed carefully without emphasis, was enough to alter the posture of everyone present. Margaret Hale did not raise her voice, nor did she repeat herself. She allowed the word to remain where it had been placed, giving it time to settle into the awareness of the board before she continued. "The company's current ownership structure," she said, her tone measured and unhurried, "has not been fully understood by all parties responsible for its governance." No one interrupted, not because they agreed, but because they recognized the precision of her statement. It was not an accusation. It was a clarification. And clarification in a legal context often preceded consequence. Gavin shifted slightly in his chair, his attention sharpening. "What exactly are you implying?" he asked. Margaret turned toward him, then her expression unchanged. "I'm not implying anything," she replied. "I'm presenting documentation." She slid the first document forward. It was not lengthy, nor was it complex in appearance. At a glance, it resembled any number of legal summaries the board had reviewed over the years, structured, formal, designed for clarity rather than interpretation. But its content carried weight that extended beyond its format. "Cartwright Holdings," Margaret continued, "is the controlling entity behind the layered investment structure that has held majority voting rights in this company since its early-stage capitalization." A brief silence followed, not confusion. Recognition. Some members of the board had seen the name before, though not in this context. It had appeared in filings, in disclosures, in documents that were reviewed and then set aside as routine. It had never been examined. Until now. Gavin frowned slightly. "That's one of the original investors," he said. "A silent partner. We've always known that." Margaret inclined her head slightly. "Yes," she said. "A silent partner." She allowed the phrase to remain in the air for a moment before continuing. "What has not been fully recognized," she added, "is the extent of that partner's control." She placed another document on the table. This one more detailed. Ownership percentages, voting rights, control provisions, all aligned, all consistent, and all pointing in the same direction. "Cartwright Holdings," she said, "retains majority ownership and full decision-making authority under the terms established at the time of investment." The room remained still, but the stillness had changed. It was no longer passive. It was processing. Gavin leaned forward, now his expression tightening. "That's not accurate," he said. "We've operated independently for years. That structure hasn't affected day-to-day control." Margaret did not respond immediately, because his statement, while understandable, did not contradict what she had presented. "Operational independence," she said calmly, "does not negate legal authority." Gavin's jaw tightened. "Then why hasn't it been exercised?" he asked. It was the first question that carried something beyond dismissal. It carried uncertainty. Margaret did not answer it directly. Instead, she turned slightly toward Joanna. "Because it was not necessary," she said. The shift in focus was subtle, but unmistakable. Several members of the board followed her gaze, and for the first time since the meeting began, Joanna became the center of the room's attention. She did not react to it. She had anticipated it. Margaret continued. The controlling interest, held by Cartwright Holdings, she said, is not abstract. It is not distributed. It is not managed by an external body. She paused. Then it is held by a single individual. The silence that followed was no longer neutral. It carried weight, expectation, and something else. Realization. Gavin's eyes moved to Joanna, not immediately, but inevitably. There was a moment, brief but distinct, where recognition began to form, though not yet fully understood. "That's not possible," he said. The words came quickly, too quickly. Margaret did not respond to the denial. She simply placed the final document on the table. Trust documentation. Verified. Signed. Legally binding. The beneficiary and controlling party of Cartwright Holdings, she said, is Joanna Cartwright. No one spoke, because there was nothing to say that would alter what had just been established. The structure was clear, the authority defined, and the implications immediate. Gavin stared at the document without touching it, as if contact might confirm something he was not prepared to accept. "That doesn't make sense," he said, his voice lower, now less certain. Why would he stop? Because the question answered itself. Not fully, but enough. Joanna met his gaze. Her expression remained composed, unchanged by the shift in the room. She did not offer explanation. She did not justify. She simply allowed the information to exist. Margaret continued, her tone consistent, unaffected by the tension that had begun to settle over the room. "This structure has been in place since the initial investment that stabilized the company during its early financial instability," she said. "It has not been altered." One of the board members leaned forward slightly, reviewing the document more closely. "This is valid?" he asked. Margaret's response was immediate. "It is enforceable," she said. There was no emphasis in her voice. None was needed. Ethan Brooks remained silent, though his attention had not shifted. He had not known the full extent of the ownership structure, but the clarity of it now aligned with what he had already begun to uncover. The patterns, the authority, the imbalance. All of it made sense. Gavin exhaled, slowly leaning back in his chair. For the first time since the meeting began, he did not speak immediately, because what had been presented was not something that could be argued through assertion. It required understanding, and understanding required time. Time he did not have. "This is," he began, then stopped again. His eyes moved between the documents and Joanna. "You never said anything," he said finally. The statement was directed at her. Not accusatory. Not yet. But searching. Joanna considered his words, then responded. There was no requirement to. Her tone was even, not defensive, not confrontational, simply accurate. Gavin shook his head slightly. "That's not," he paused, recalibrating. "That's not how this works." Margaret intervened before he could continue. "It is exactly how it works," she said. The interruption was not aggressive. It was precise. "Ownership does not require disclosure beyond legal obligation," she continued. "All obligations have been met." The board members exchanged brief glances, not of confusion, but of alignment, because the structure once revealed left little room for reinterpretation. Control had been defined, not claimed, not argued, established. Margaret closed the folder in front of her. "The purpose of this clarification," she said, "is not retrospective. It is forward." She allowed that to settle before continuing, because the authority associated with that control is now being exercised. The room did not move, but something within it shifted, from recognition to consequence. Gavin's posture changed, not dramatically, but enough. "What does that mean?" he asked. Margaret looked at him directly. "It means," she said, "that decisions made within this company are subject to review and, where necessary, correction." A pause. Then, effectively immediately. The words did not carry volume, but they carried finality. Joanna remained still, her hands resting lightly in front of her, her presence unchanged, but the space around her had redefined itself, not through force, not through declaration, but through structure. And structure, once acknowledged, did not require reinforcement, only application. The room did not erupt. There were no raised voices, no immediate objections, no visible collapse of order. Instead, what followed the disclosure of Joanna's control was something quieter and far more consequential. The shift from recognition to consequence did not happen through reaction. It happened through procedure. Margaret Hale did not allow the moment to expand into uncertainty. She moved forward with the same measured clarity that had defined every step leading up to it, as though what had just been revealed was not an interruption, but the natural continuation of a process already in motion. Before we proceed further, she said, there are additional materials that require review. She did not look at Gavin when she spoke. She did not need to. Her attention remained with the board. A folder was opened, another document placed on the table. Then a device, small, unremarkable, until it was not. Gavin's eyes moved toward it instinctively, not because he recognized it, but because something in the room had shifted again. Margaret's hand rested briefly on the device before she spoke. The following recording, she said, was taken during the company's annual partnership gala last week. No one interrupted, because now they understood what that meant. She pressed play. The video began without introduction. No title, no explanation, only motion, sound, and the unmistakable clarity of what had occurred. The ballroom appeared as it had been that evening, lit in warm tones, filled with movement, conversation, the quiet rhythm of a space designed to project stability. Then the moment unfolded, not abruptly, but inevitably. Gavin's voice, sharp, dismissive. The words themselves did not need to be repeated. Their tone carried enough. Then, the movement, the impact, Joanna's head turning slightly with the force, the silence that followed, the stillness of the room, the absence of intervention. Every frame existed exactly as it had occurred, unaltered, undeniable. Margaret stopped, not because it was incomplete, but because it did not need to continue. What mattered had already been shown. The device was placed back on the table. No one spoke, because there was no interpretation to offer, no alternate version to suggest. The evidence did not invite discussion. It established fact. Gavin remained still, not composed, not entirely, but contained. His expression had changed, not dramatically, not in a way that would draw immediate attention, but enough that those who knew how to observe could see it. The certainty that had defined him had shifted, not gone, but disrupted. That doesn't show context, he said finally. The words were measured, but they lacked the authority they once carried. Margaret responded without delay. Context, she said, does not alter the action. Gavin's jaw tightened. It was taken out of. Multiple witnesses were present, she continued, her tone unchanged. And the recording aligns with documented statements. She did not raise her voice. She did not interrupt him forcefully. She simply continued. And in doing so, she removed the space in which his explanation might have taken hold. Ethan Brooks spoke for the first time since the presentation began. From a governance perspective, he said, his tone, even this constitutes a liability. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. The board understood, not only the personal implications, but the corporate ones. Reputational damage, legal exposure, breach of fiduciary responsibility. Each of these existed independently. Together, they formed something that could not be dismissed. Margaret placed another document on the table. Supporting materials, she said. This time the contents were not visual. They were structured. Financial records, transaction logs, approval chains, each aligned with the patterns Ethan had identified. Each connected, not through assumption, through documentation. These records, Margaret continued, demonstrate repeated use of company funds for purposes not aligned with corporate interest. She did not name Lila Monroe immediately. She did not need to. The documents did it for her. Dates, locations, associations, patterns, all consistent, all verifiable. Ethan leaned forward slightly, reviewing the materials as they were distributed. What he saw confirmed what he had already documented. But confirmation in this context carried more weight than discovery. because now it was shared. Gavin looked at the documents, then back at Margaret. "You're presenting this as misconduct?" he asked. The question carried an edge now. Not defensive, but strained. Margaret met his gaze. "I'm presenting it as evidence," she said. There was no emphasis, no escalation, just clarity. One of the board members spoke, then his voice measured, his expression controlled. "These expenditures," he said, "were not disclosed." Gavin responded immediately. "They were operational decisions," he said, "within my authority." Ethan spoke again. "Authority," he said, "does not extend to personal use of corporate funds." The distinction was precise, and once stated, difficult to refute. Gavin leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. For the first time, he did not respond immediately, because the structure around him had changed. The conversation was no longer between him and an individual. It was between him and a system. And that system was no longer aligned in his favor. Margaret closed the folder in front of her. "We are not here to debate interpretation," she said. "We are here to establish position." She allowed that to settle before continuing. "The position based on the materials presented is as follows. The current chief executive officer has engaged in conduct that exposes the company to significant legal and reputational risk and has acted outside the scope of fiduciary responsibility." The room remained silent, not because there was nothing to say, but because what had been said was sufficient. Joanna had not spoken. Not once. Her presence remained unchanged, her posture steady, her expression neutral. She did not look at Gavin. She did not look at the board. She simply remained. And in that stillness, her position was understood, not asserted, established. Gavin looked at her then, fully, for the first time since the meeting began. There was something in his expression now that had not been there before. Not anger, not disbelief. Recognition, not of what had been said, but of what it meant. "You planned this," he said. The words were quiet, not accusatory. Not yet. But searching for something to hold. Joanna met his gaze. She did not respond immediately. "Then no," she said. A pause. "Then I prepared." The distinction was small, but absolute. Margaret turned slightly toward the board. "Given the evidence presented," she said, "we recommend immediate action. No elaboration, none required, because the next step was procedural. And procedure, once initiated, did not rely on emotion. It relied on structure. Votes would be called. Positions would be reassessed. Authority would be redefined. Not through confrontation, but through alignment. And as the board prepared to move from acknowledgement to decision, one thing had already become clear. The outcome was no longer uncertain. It had been built, piece by piece, document by document, silence by silence, until it reached this point, where it no longer required defense, only recognition. The decision, when it came, did not arrive with emphasis. There was no raised hand that carried more weight than the others, no single voice that defined the outcome. Instead, it emerged through a process that was both formal and inevitable, one that reflected not emotion, but alignment. The board did not rush. Each member reviewed the materials again, not because they had missed anything, but because the act of reviewing confirmed what had already been established. The ownership structure, the financial records, the video each existed independently, and yet together they formed a continuity that left little room for ambiguity. Margaret did not speak during this phase. She did not need to. Her role had been to present. Now the structure would complete itself. Gavin remained seated, his posture still composed, though no longer anchored in certainty. His hands rested on the table, unmoving, as if motion might suggest something he was not prepared to reveal. He did not interrupt the process, not because he accepted it, but because he had begun to understand that interruption would not alter its direction. Across from him, Joanna sat with the same stillness she had maintained throughout the meeting. Her presence had not expanded, nor had it receded. It remained constant, defined not by action, but by position. She did not look at the documents again. She did not need to. She had already seen what they contained. She had already understood where they would lead. The chairman of the board cleared his throat quietly, a signal not of authority but of transition. "We will proceed to a vote," he said. The words were simple, expected, and yet within them the outcome began to take form. The motion was stated clearly: temporary removal of Gavin Cartwright from the position of Chief Executive Officer, pending further investigation into conduct and financial oversight. No embellishment. No qualification, just the structure of consequence. One by one the votes were cast. Not dramatically, not hesitantly. Each member spoke in turn, their voices steady, their decisions aligned, not with one another but with the evidence that had been presented. Ethan did not vote. His role did not require it, but his presence remained, his attention fixed not on Gavin nor on Joanna but on the process itself, as if ensuring that what had begun would be carried through without deviation. The result, when it was finalized, was not announced with emphasis. It did not need to be. It existed, and in its existence it redefined everything that had come before. Gavin did not react immediately. There was no visible collapse, no outward display of resistance. Instead, he sat in a stillness that mirrored Joanna's own, but where hers had been grounded in control, his was shaped by recognition, not of the vote, but of the structure that had led to it. "You're removing me," he said. The statement was not a question. The chairman inclined his head slightly. "Effective immediately," he replied. A pause followed, then more quietly, pending further review. Gavin's eyes moved across the table, not searching for support, but confirming its absence. No one spoke, because there was nothing to add. The decision had not been personal. It had been procedural, and procedure did not accommodate reversal without cause. Gavin exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. For a moment it seemed as though he might speak again, might attempt to reframe, to challenge, to assert. But he did not, because whatever argument might have existed no longer held. Not against documentation, not against structure, not against control that had already shifted. His gaze settled briefly on Joanna. There was no accusation in it, no anger, only a quiet, delayed understanding. She had not opposed him. She had not confronted him. She had not even spoken, and yet she had changed everything. Joanna met his gaze without hesitation. Her expression remained unchanged. There was no satisfaction in it, no sense of resolution, only presence. Then she looked away, not dismissively, but because there was nothing left to be exchanged. Margaret spoke again, her voice re-entering the room with the same measured clarity it had carried from the beginning. "We will proceed with the formal documentation," she said. "Interim leadership will be assigned, and internal review will begin immediately." The chairman nodded. Arrangements were discussed. Succession, temporary authority, operational continuity, all of it addressed with the same precision that had defined the meeting. Because the company, despite what had occurred, would continue. It had to, and now it would do so under a different structure. Gavin stood, not abruptly, not with resistance, but with a controlled motion that suggested decision rather than reaction. "I'll need access to my office," he said. The chairman nodded again. "Arrangements will be made," he replied. There was no confrontation, no attempt to prevent him, because the removal was not physical, it was structural. His authority had been redefined. Everything else would follow. Gavin did not look at Joanna again as he turned toward the door. He did not speak to anyone else. He simply left, and as the door closed behind him, the room did not exhale. It did not relax, because what had taken place was not an ending. It was a transition, one that would continue beyond that room. Lila Monroe's name surfaced shortly after, not dramatically, not with accusation, but within the context of the financial records that had been presented. Her involvement, once peripheral, now carried weight. An internal review would address it. Her position as it stood would not remain unchanged. Joanna listened as these details were outlined. She did not intervene. She did not expand on what had already been shown, because the process no longer required her input. It required only continuation. When the meeting concluded, there was no formal acknowledgement of what had been achieved. No closing statement, no reflection. The board members gathered their documents, their movements quiet, deliberate. One by one they left. Margaret remained seated for a moment longer, organizing the materials with the same care she had applied throughout. Then she looked at Joanna. "It's done," she said. Joanna considered the words, then nodded. Yes, she replied, but her tone suggested something else. Not completion. Continuation. Because what had been done was not the end of the process. It was the beginning of its visible phase. They stood. No further discussion. No need. As Joanna walked toward the door, she paused briefly, not to look back but to register the space. The table, the chairs, the room that had held the moment where structure became action. Then she stepped out. The hallway beyond was quiet, unchanged, as if nothing had occurred. And in a way that was true, because what had changed was not the environment. It was the structure beneath it. And that structure would hold. Without noise, without display, without the need to prove itself again. Joanna walked forward, her pace steady, her posture unchanged. Behind her, the company continued. Ahead of her, something else waited. Not defined, not announced, but hers, to choose. The building did not change after Gavin left. Its glass exterior still reflected the same skyline. Elevators continued their quiet ascent and descent. Conversations resumed, schedules reassembled, and the rhythm of the company so carefully constructed over years reasserted itself with practiced ease. From the outside, nothing appeared different. From within, everything had shifted. The transition of leadership was executed with the same discretion that had defined the meeting itself. An interim chief executive officer was appointed within hours, Daniel Reeves, a senior executive with a reputation for stability rather than ambition. His presence did not disrupt. It absorbed. Announcements were made internally. Measured. Neutral. Effective immediately, Mr. Gavin Cartwright will be stepping down from his role as CEO pending ongoing review. Mr. Daniel Reeves will assume interim leadership responsibilities. No mention of the video, no reference to the board meeting, no explanation beyond what was necessary. Because explanation in this context was not required. Those who needed to understand already did. Lila Monroe's departure followed 2 days later. It was handled even more quietly. Her access was revoked. Her position dissolved under the language of organizational restructuring. There was no confrontation, no public acknowledgement, no opportunity for narrative. She left the building once, escorted not by security but by protocol. Her expression remained composed. But the structure that had supported her informal, unspoken, dependent on proximity, had already disappeared. And without it, there was nothing left to sustain her position. Ethan Brooks remained, his role unchanged, though his awareness of the system around him had deepened. The patterns he had identified were now part of a larger structure, one that no longer required interpretation. He did not seek recognition. He did not need to, because what mattered had already aligned. In Margaret Hale's office, the final documentation for the corporate proceedings was completed with the same precision that had defined every step. Statements were filed, records secured, processes initiated. There was no urgency, only sequence. Joanna reviewed each document before signing, not out of necessity, out of consistency. Her signature appeared where required, clean, deliberate, binding. The personal proceedings followed shortly after. The filing for divorce was submitted without announcement, without delay, and without deviation from the structure that had been established. Grounds were listed: abuse, financial misconduct, breach of fiduciary responsibility. Each supported, each documented, each aligned with the evidence that had already been presented. Gavin received the notice in his own time, not in a courtroom, not in a confrontation, but through delivery, formal, unavoidable. His response when it came was not immediate, because the process did not require it to be. Negotiations, if they could be called, that remained minimal. There was little to contest. The ownership structure had already been established. The financial records already reviewed. The incident already documented. What remained was not argument. It was conclusion. Joanna did not attend every meeting. She did not engage in prolonged discussion. She allowed the process to proceed through the structure she had already set in motion. Because involvement at this stage would not change the outcome. It would only prolong it. Weeks passed. Not quickly, not slowly, but with the steady progression of things that had already been decided. The divorce was finalized without public attention. Terms agreed upon. Assets divided according to a structure that reflected not negotiation but alignment with what had always been in place. Gavin did not return to the company. His absence became permanent, not through announcement but through continuity. Meetings continued without him. Decisions were made without his input. His name, once central, became historical. Not erased, but no longer active. Joanna did not assume the role of CEO. The option existed. The authority allowed it. But she declined. Because control for her had never been about position. It had been about structure. She appointed a permanent executive team, individuals selected not for loyalty but for capability. Systems were reviewed, processes adjusted, oversight redefined. The company stabilized, not dramatically, but steadily, because stability, like everything else that mattered, did not require display. It required consistency. Months later, in a quiet hospital room far removed from boardrooms and legal offices, Joanna sat beside a window as early morning light moved slowly across the floor. The city outside was still. Not silent, but not yet awake. She held her child in her arms, small, still, unaware of the structures that had shaped the world into which they had been born. Joanna looked at the child for a long moment, not with the intensity of someone searching for meaning, but with the calm recognition of something that did not need to be defined. There was no urgency in her expression, no lingering tension, only presence. The past had not disappeared. It had been resolved. Not emotionally, but structurally. And that resolution had created space, not empty, but open, for something else. She stood after a while, moving toward the window, the child resting quietly against her. The light had shifted, slightly brighter now. The city beginning to move again. Joanna did not think about Gavin, not because she avoided it, but because there was nothing left to consider. What had been between them had already reached its conclusion, not through confrontation, not through words, but through actions that had defined themselves. She had not needed to respond. She had not needed to argue. She had only needed to observe, to record, to act when the structure required it. And when she did, it held. That was enough. The nurse entered quietly, pausing just inside the door. "Everything all right?" she asked. Joanna turned slightly. "Yes," she said. Her voice was steady, uncomplicated. The nurse smiled and nodded before stepping back out, leaving the room as it had been. Joanna remained by the window for a moment longer. Then she returned to the chair, settling into it with the same quiet composure that had carried her through everything that had come before. Outside, the day continued. Inside, nothing needed to be said, because what mattered had already been done, and what remained was hers. To live, without explanation, without display, without the need to prove it to anyone. In the end, nothing about Joanna's story demanded attention. There were no dramatic speeches, no public confrontations, no moments designed to humiliate or reclaim power in visible ways. What unfolded instead was something quieter and perhaps more difficult to recognize at first, a steady alignment between truth and consequence, shaped not by reaction but by restraint. She had not raised her voice. She had not sought validation. She had not even corrected the assumptions made about her, not until those assumptions began to carry weight that required response. And when she did respond, it was not through emotion. It was through structure, through records, through timing, through an understanding that power, when real, does not need to announce itself. It only needs to exist long enough to be recognized. What happened to Gavin was not sudden. It was the result of choices, small ones at first, then larger ones, each made with the belief that they would remain contained. But actions once taken do not disappear simply because they are ignored. They accumulate, they align, and eventually they define the outcome. Joanna did not force that outcome. She allowed it, and in doing so she walked away with something that could not be taken from her: clarity, dignity, and a life that no longer required her to remain silent for the sake of someone else's illusion. If you've stayed with this story, you already understand that not all strength is loud and not all justice arrives with noise. Sometimes it moves quietly. And sometimes that is exactly what makes it undeniable. If this story meant something to you, feel free to share where you're watching from and what time it is where you are right now. I read every response, and if you believe in stories where truth unfolds slowly but holds firmly when it does, you can stay connected for more like this.